Well, thanks so much for the introduction, Geisha, and thank you to our panelists. I hope everyone watching has been enjoying the event as much as I have. It's been a great series of panels this morning and yesterday as well. I'm Paul McLeary from Politico, and this is Putin's big fail. We'll be talking about the news of the day and what we can expect next from the Kremlin and from Western allies and the Ukrainian government in prosecuting this war and seeing what's next with a mix of diplomacy, military action, and it's going to be a tough road. So with us is Anne Applebaum, staff writer for The Atlantic, Konstantin Sonin, the John Dewey Distinguished Service Professor at the University of Chicago, and Olga Tokariuk, I hope I got that right, Olga, the fellow at the Center for European Policy Analysis. I mean, the big thing everyone's talking about right now, there's a few things, but is the forced conscription of at least 300,000 Russian men into the army, if they're going to be flowed right into Ukraine, which it appears they are, and what this means for the war. Olga, if we can start with you. Clearly, this fight is personal for you. What do you think the influx of tens of thousands or hundreds of thousands of lightly trained, lightly equipped soldiers into the conflict as winter sets in, can this move the needle at all, do you think, or is this just going to be a disaster for Russia as the Ukrainians keep their counteroffensive, or what do you see happening in the fall months here?
Well, it can be both. In fact, it will still present a lot of problems for the Ukrainian army in terms of manpower. Of course, Russia is outnumbering Ukraine and sending this newly mobilized soldiers, albeit they will be ill-equipped and ill-prepared for the war, will still give an advantage to Russia. Ukraine, however, is aware of what is coming and is trying to use this window of opportunity that is still now before this huge number of newly mobilized Russian soldiers arrive to reclaim more territory. It's continuing its offensive in the eastern part of the country, and it has some troubles with an offensive in the south, but it still tries to advance. Well, the troubles are mostly connected to the fact that there is not enough artillery, not enough military equipment, not enough weapons that are coming to Ukraine from the west. Of course, this new arrivals, they will present some problems for the Ukrainian army. That is for sure. Ukraine will also probably have to mobilize more people and to send more soldiers to the front line. But the main issue still remains in terms of the struggle between the strategies, and Ukrainian military strategy so far has proved to be more efficient than the Russian one. Ukraine is not winning thanks to the sheer numbers. It's winning or it's advancing, it's counter-advancing, it's counter-attacking, it's reclaiming territory thanks to the wise strategy, thanks to more efficient planning, more efficient work of its military forces, and of course Ukrainian soldiers are more motivated than Russian soldiers. But the crucial issue here is still the weapons. Will Ukraine receive more weapons? What kind of weapons it will receive? This will ultimately decide the outcome.
Yeah, we know there's going to be another package announced later today, 1.1 billion from the United States to Ukraine, and this isn't the things that will arrive in the next few weeks. This is the longer term financing for things like air defense and things like that. And Olga, we'll start with you quickly, and then I'll ask Anne. This is a two-pronged strategy by the United States to send equipment and munitions quickly, but also start preparing for the long haul. Are you surprised at all that there hasn't been more done, especially during these counteroffensives by the United States or the West, to get more weapons there quickly, and there seems to be more of a focus on this long-term equipping and supply?
Well, Ukraine has been repeating for months that it needs tanks, that it needs fighter jets, that it needs more air defense systems. That is starting to arrive very gradually, very slowly. Well, Ukraine was promised some more air defense systems. Well, with tanks, there are issues, and with fighter jets, this is not on the table yet. But Ukraine is continuing to stress how important is that. And I think this counteroffensive that we've seen in September, that hopefully has tip the balance in favor of sending those weapons that maybe were not on the table, were not yet discussed as, that they would be sent in the near future to Ukraine, because exactly the US and other Ukraine's partners, they've seen that Ukrainian army is using these weapons very efficiently, that is very capable to, even with the limited resources, distribute those resources and use them very efficiently. But more, of course, Ukraine is insisting that these weapons need to be sent in much larger numbers and faster.
Right. And with the forced conscription here, we've seen on social media some evidence of social unrest. It's been very localized, pretty small. Do you think that this could be something that will have a larger effect on the Putin regime if the social unrest continues or grows?
I mean, of course it could. I think there are 2 points to make about the conscription that are important. One is that this is clearly a form of the regime's war on Russia. So it's not just a war on Ukraine, it's also a war for control of Russia, for control of the small but influential nationalist movement, which wants Putin to do more, which has been egging him on to do more conscription for a while. So it's a way of satisfying them. It's clearly aimed at poorer, more provincial and ethnic minorities inside Russia. So the conscription is much wider and broader in Dagestan, which is why you've seen the protests there. And in other regions, and also very high number of Crimean Tatars apparently also being conscripted. And so in a way, the conscription is aimed at those parts of the Russian population that are both farthest away from the capital, but also maybe the most risky for the regime. So they clearly are using the conscription as part of politics, as a part of staying in control. I think the second point about it is related to what Olga was talking about a minute ago. It's very hard in some ways to understand the conscription. I mean, what's the point of sending badly trained, badly equipped men to the front line? The only way it can really be understood is that it's part of Russia's broader political plan. In other words, the idea is just to make the war last as long as possible, in order so that the West will get tired, so that Europe will peel off or break off, so that changes maybe in U.S. politics, maybe the midterm elections. I don't know exactly what the Russians are hoping for, but they're hoping for a loss of faith or a loss of energy. And towards that end, that's what this conscription is for. That's what the nuclear threats are for. And that's what the sort of ongoing, political manipulation and political messaging in pretty much every European country and many other countries as well is aimed at. So the point of the mobilization is not entirely military in the way that we usually think of it. It's not like it's part of a strategy on the ground. It's part of a strategy of lasting longer. So they want to outlast the winter. They want to last into the spring. They want to, basically break the will of the West before their own will is broken in some way. And that seems to be the main point of it. And that's why actually I think that the more long-term language that the West uses, in other words, long-term planning for equipping the Ukrainian military 6 months from now or a year from now, while that might sound frustrating to some Ukrainians who want stuff immediately, it has a very, very useful and important, that's a very useful and important psychological message to be sending to the Russians. We're not leaving, in the next 2 months. We're not leaving in the next 6 months. We're staying there. And that's the best way, in my view, to counter this news of mobilization.
Yeah, and there's a meeting in Brussels today of several dozen nations led by the United States, the acquisition officials from each NATO country and other nations who are mapping some of that strategy out, and also how to restock domestic warehouses that were, of equipment that was sent to Russia. So there's that aspect happening too. I mean, just today, we'll find out later today what they said. Konstantin, how risky, jumping off what Anne was just saying, how risky is this strategy by Putin to call up hundreds of thousands of conscripts, even if they're coming from some of the poor regions? I mean, if they go to Ukraine, it's cold, it's wet. Ukrainians are pretty well equipped and very motivated. and start taking massive losses or surrendering en masse, I mean, how will this blow back on the Kremlin, do you think?
Okay, I do not think that this is risky for Putin. I think this is risky for these people who will be slaughtered, coming unprepared. We've already seen evidence that people who were conscripted on September 21, they were caught in Ukraine. They were lucky to be caught rather than killed in Ukraine on September 27. So I totally agree with Anna that I think this mobilization is not thought through as something important for the military exercise. This is mostly about keeping power internally, to have the country basically mobilized, to have all these people sitting in the FSB offices, Rosguardia offices, busy with now tracking conscripts and tracking all kind of anti-mobilization activity. So this is the internal means of control. But otherwise, I think this is like a totally disastrous policy in terms of the economy. They're mobilizing hundreds of thousands people, at least 300,000 people already left during the last week. And although it's difficult to put just an exact number on how damaging this for the economy, but also there is no question that this is extremely damaging for the Russian economy. So like long term, this is just digging his own grave. But one thing that I want to emphasize, that every time we think that Putin plays like a 10-dimensional chess, we are mistaken. We constantly over the last years overestimate his competence and underestimate his will. So these things are stupid. They would not help him. He's digging his own grave. That's because they're like sleepwalking into a huge disaster.
And how is the West, how would you gauge the West's response, especially the Baltic states who are not taking some of these men who want to flee Russia, who don't want to be conscripted, and they say we're not taking anyone in? Do you think that's a mistake, or is that?
Well, I think a lot of discussions about Baltic countries, they constantly ignore how small these countries are. It's like discussions of Ukraine before the war that were ignoring the fact that Ukraine is one of the largest European countries. Now people discuss Baltic countries as if they were comparable in size to, say, Poland or Germany. For Estonia or Latvia, accepting like 300 refugees, it's a big security issue. So like whatever I want for my friends in Moscow who are fleeing, I totally understand that for each of these countries, the security concerns, the logistic concerns, they come first. So I totally understand that small countries cannot accept a lot of refugees. That's actually different with Uzbekistan, which is a huge country and could easily accept tens of thousands of refugees.
Right. And is there a point where, Putin and his regime seem to be kind of backing themselves into a corner here, right? I mean, they've, someone blew up the Nord Stream pipeline in the Baltic. There's this conscription, there's some social unrest, the economy is taking a hit. At what point do you think that they would become so desperate as to do something radical, like Medvedev has been threatening the use of nuclear weapons? I mean, are there off-ramps to that point, or are we beyond that? And
I think most of what they think is based on a kind of mal-informed delusion. So like basically they thought that they would take Kyiv in 3 days and have a military parade with Ukrainians running to welcome Putin there. The same way they think about United States and Europe, they think that United States commitment to Ukraine would waver for some reason, that Trump would win elections and miraculously remove sanctions and stop the military aid, although this is as delusional as the 3-day military operation on Kyiv. I do not see why they would use nuclear weapons. Basically, every time Putin is met with force, he folds. He has this like small criminal thuggish mentality, like attack the weak, fold when you encounter strong. So I would not expect them to use nukes. At the same time, Seabov, they're sort of delusional. If they have this delusion that the NATO army is converging on Moscow, then probably they would.
And how would you gauge the West's response, particularly NATO? I mean, it's been pretty united and solid. I mean, but so far, but you have some outliers. You have the Turkeys and Hungary and this new far right government in Italy. We'll see what happens there. I mean, is there any risk of the West's alliance kind of shattering, maybe especially over the winter as things maybe grind down?
Okay, as always, there are a lot of things to criticize, but I think like historically, if you put this in a historical perspective, both the response of the United States government, not only Biden administration, but bipartisan, both parties, everything, and Europe, this was a stellar response. Certainly a lot of lessons of the Munich 1938, they were learned. Not everything is optimal. I mean, by far, not everything is optimal, but I think historically it's a much better response than, say, to Syrian crisis a couple of years ago and the previous wars, Rwanda genocide. There were a lot of historical episodes, international episodes, in which the reaction of the Western Europe and United States was much worse than this. This is a kind of, again, stellar reaction in a historical perspective.
And Anne, I'm curious your take on that.
I agree that the overall response has been excellent. I mean, in some ways, surprisingly good. It is true that, I mean, literally within each country, you can see forces that are either pro-Russian or anti-war, or anti-Ukrainian or anti-NATO, or some combination of those three. And there will be a political battle, in which those forces play a role. That it did play a role in the Italian elections. So far, one of the decisions that Giorgia Meloni has made is to be pro-NATO and pro-Ukraine. And that was part of, portraying herself as a moderate force, but some of her government coalition partners have a different view. So, that's, as you say, still playing itself out. I mean, but if you look across the board, if you look at France, if you look at, Austria, if you look at, and of course, the United States, there is certainly a part of the Republican Party, and there's clearly a part of the Republican media establishment that remains really quite openly pro-Putin and openly anti-NATO and against this policy. And so that, you have to understand and that argument will continue to play itself out in different places. And and there will be a Russian role in that argument as well, as there always has been. I mean, some, kind of bots and trolls, and at that level, but also at the level of, there are big Russian investments in European and in maybe even American business, in media. There are, there's a kind of Russian influence game that happens on a number of levels. It's not just about information or about narratives. And that will go on mattering, particularly in the winter when gas begins to run out and energy prices are very high. Another place, obviously, to look is Moldova, where there will be a very loud pro-Russian force that will be against the government on the, and will be offering lower gas prices if they can oust the government. So that kind of argument will play itself out. So I don't want to be overly naive about that. I do think that there's been a kind of sea change, most importantly in Germany, but elsewhere. The Germans are rightly criticized for their reluctance to give certain kinds of weapons and so on. But it seems to me that there's been a mentality change that's important, in that the degree to which Europe was reliant on Russian gas and the naivete that many Europeans had about Putin's intentions in Ukraine and elsewhere in Europe seems to be falling away. And it seems to be something that even the general public understands. For example, German public opinion polling is pretty good. And that's true in other countries as well. So I really feel that Putin, in a way, has whatever support he might have had before the war, he may have lost some of it simply by the sheer brutality and viciousness of this war, the bombing campaigns against civilians, the crimes against human rights, this kind of use of genocidal language and genocidal practices. I mean, I think that's, particularly in Germany, has had really important impact. And so while I don't want to be overly optimistic about, as I said, each country has its own political battle and it will run differently in different places. Putin has lost a lot of friends or fair weather allies, people who are willing to go along with him for the sake of the business deal. A lot of that is going to be gone now.
Mm-hmm. Thanks. And Olga, in Kiev, I know there's been, some pro-Russian parties in Ukrainian politics and figures. Obviously, one was just traded back to Russia for Ukrainian soldiers. What is the view of the West's response, and is there fear that it could begin to waver over time? The United States is already with a $40 billion package in the spring, another 11 billion, and then there's another 11 billion coming up. It's a lot of money, even for a country like the United States. Is there any fear there in Ukraine that money will run out, or that will to spend it and the will to give up equipment will run out over time?
Yeah, I wouldn't say that there is fear. Maybe it's not the correct word. There is maybe some anxiety or preoccupation, that there might be some Ukraine fatigue or war fatigue, because Ukrainians cannot afford to have war fatigue, because they are living this war every day. Every day there are news coming from the front line about someone's loved ones being killed or taken as prisoners of war. There are accounts, of horrible human rights abuses on the territories that were occupied by Russia in Kherson region, in Kharkiv region. In Kherson region is still under occupation, of course, and parts of Zaporizhia region where sham referendums were just conducted these days. So the war is very real for Ukrainians, and this issue of war fatigue is something that is very difficult to explain to a Ukrainian. How can someone in another country have a war fatigue if they didn't even experience the war? And and also the fact that it's Ukrainians who are shielding now the rest of European Union, starting from countries like Poland and Baltic states from Russian aggression, is again something that gives Ukrainians legitimacy in their demands and claims that the world does not turn away, that it continues supporting Ukraine, sending weapons, sending money, and stepping up the support. Of course, people are aware that the winter that is coming will be very tough. Of course, it will be tough for Ukrainians, many of whom will probably be left without electricity and heating. Russia already demonstrated that it's ready to bomb the objects of infrastructure, power stations, electrical plants that ensure electricity and heating, and it will continue. It will probably step up these bombings as the winter approaches. And again, and of course, the consumers in Western countries will experience the rise of prices for the electricity and heating, but still, these are not comparable things. The suffering that Ukrainians are enduring and what people in other countries might face. So so this is Ukrainians' perspective, how they see the situation, and in every occasion they will of course continue repeating that yes, you feel remote consequences, but we are paying with our lives. We are freezing, our people are getting killed, tortured, and put in prisons just for nothing. Their bodies are found in mass graves. So of course the consequences cannot be compared. So I think Ukrainians will be very firm in continuing to demand that the world steps up and does not turn away from what is happening, because it's Ukrainians who are defending the values of democracy and freedom, defending literally EU countries, but not just the EU, from further aggression by Russia. And it's from this perspective that the reaction of the West will be judged in Ukraine. And one other thing that I want to add is I think it is quite common for Ukrainians to complain that the West is too reactive in this situation, that there is a lack of proactive strategy to counter or to calculate or to predict further Russia's moves. So Russia always has the initiative. Now with this nuclear blackmail, with the explosions on the Nord Stream 1 and Nord Stream 2 underwater pipelines. So it's again that Russia is escalating. It's again that Russia is making the step that forces the West to respond. So maybe something more proactive, more active actions that somehow predict Russia's next moves and counter them before they arrive is what is expected in Ukraine from Ukraine's Western partners.
Mm. And I know the French foreign ministers arrived in Kyiv yesterday, and there's been a pretty steady stream of foreign politicians and ministers of defense and heads of state heading to Kyiv. Are those? I mean, there's a symbolism there, right? But it's also a concrete commitment, at least in the near term, to Ukraine's sovereignty. How important has it been for President Zelensky to welcome those heads of state and those officials and walk the streets of Kyiv and be photographed doing that? I mean, what does that mean for the Ukrainian people? I mean, does that mean something to them that shows support or some strength or?
Well, of course, it means that, first of all, they have the courage to come to Ukraine and to visit Kyiv, because still some months ago, only politicians and leaders from Ukraine's neighboring countries were arriving, but not that many Western politicians and Western leaders. Now we're seeing more and more politicians from countries further west that are arriving to Ukraine, demonstrating support and pledging solidarity and saying that they will, stand with Ukraine until the end. So, of course, for Ukrainian people, this is a sign, of that we are not alone, that, the world has not abandoned Ukraine, that the attention is still focused on what is happening, that Ukraine is not alone in this fight, although it's the Ukrainian soldiers who are defending not just Ukraine, but, the democracy and the values of freedom and human rights. But there is the solidarity of other countries who share the same values. So in the sense of giving a morale boost, it's of course very important.
Right. Konstantin, the referendums that are just wrapping up in the East, have literally been done at gunpoint in some places. How is this going to play out? I mean, it seems the end game here for the Russians is to say, well, this region must be part of Russia, as part of Russia. And if Ukraine attacks, now that becomes in their minds Russian sovereign territory, right? And that's supposed to be the red line, that Ukraine can't attack Russian territory, but it's not recognized anywhere in the West. So how does this play out? I mean, does Ukraine and the West just ignore these referendums and continue on?
Oh, I actually think that if even journalists would just ignore this, then this would be better. Like every time it's mentioned, I mean, even the word referendum is mentioned, it's not clear what is happening there, because obviously they report totally impossible numbers. The turnout numbers, they're like totally impossible. It's even difficult to say. I wrote some academic papers on election forensic. But here, I mean, you cannot even to point out the evidence of fraud, because this is just made up data. You cannot have this kind of turnout even in peacetime, given that the people are not just present there. You cannot have the turnout close to the turnout of elections in the peaceful time. There are hundreds of thousands of refugees from these regions, of people who are relocated in both in Ukraine and abroad and Russia. So this is just, I mean, this is just totally fake. It's like in my childhood, when my parents always took me to the election booth, but regardless of what we did there, the report was 99% turnout, 99% votes for the single candidate. And now what we know is that in the Soviet Union, they even did not count the votes at this time. They just reported. So I think that's what they actually do in these so-called referendums. They just report the fake numbers. They're obviously fake. I don't know who cares. I assume that they feed it to themselves, like Kiriyenko tells Putin, oh, 90%, 98% voted to join Russia, and Putin says, yes, that's what I expected. That's why we're doing this. But I mean, this is like a crazy theater for themselves. We just watch this change game, but I do not think that it should have any bearing on what people do supporting Ukraine. It should not have any bearing on what Ukrainians do.
And to continue on that point, I mean, are these sham referendums done for domestic consumption in Russia, do you think? Are they done just to give it a shot and see if anyone believes that they're true? Is the Kremlin that divorced from reality that they think something like this will gain international legitimacy? I mean, do you have a sense of why and how?
Yeah, so my understanding is they're doing this in order to annex those territories, which they'll do almost immediately afterwards, and then to claim that any attack on those territories is an attack on Russia. And the point of that, again, it's part of an intimidation game. You know, they're attempting to scare the West with this talk of nuclear weapons. And they've said, you know, if you an attack on Russia, Russian territory means we have to use nuclear weapons to defend Russia. So I think it's part of it's, as I said, it's part of, you know, this huge propaganda push to get the West to withdraw or move back or stop fighting. And that's the goal of it. And then, you know, then we're back to the question of would they really use nuclear weapons? And that depends on so many, you know, other factors. You know, there isn't really a way they could use them that makes sense militarily. It's not clear even that there's a way they could use them that makes sense politically. There would be a huge pushback from, you know, not just from the West, but from China, from India, from all of Russia's other allies in the world. And it's hard to imagine how they use them in a way that helps them in this war. But the language of the referendums is very tied to that issue, and they're going to, and you'll see, as soon as they announce the annexations, they will start using nuclear language again.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think the Biden administration, Jake Sullivan, the national security advisor, has kind of laid out that red line for Ukraine aid, that we're not going to supply Ukraine with anything that could launch attacks into Russia, which if you put a howitzer close enough to the border with Ukraine on the border, you could launch an attack into Russia. So this could be part of Russia trying to force that and saying, well, this is Russia now, so you can't attack. Yeah,
yes.
Yeah. And have you been surprised at all by the Biden administration's being so forthright about those red lines? I mean, they've had red lines about HIMARS and things like that and crossed them, but they really seem to be sticking with this no long-range artillery, no long-range rocketry.
I mean, this has been part of their messaging campaign to Russia. You know, we'll stick to certain borderlines if you stick to other borderlines. But I think it's also the case that as the war has gone on, some things have changed. I mean, the understanding of what the Russian army is and is not capable of has changed over the last few months. The understanding of what the Russian red lines are have changed. So some of that has evolved, but I mean, I do think the Biden administration wants to be seen, you know, as not provocative. You know, they don't want to be blamed for provoking some even more horrific attack than the ones we have. And I understand that. I mean, I do sometimes worry that this is a kind of game with no rules. I mean, who says what is provocative and what isn't, and who's deciding what's escalatory and what isn't? It's very hard to, if during the Cold War there were some accepted signs and signals that developed over many years, and there were red telephones on people's desks and so on. We don't have that anymore, and so a lot of this is just guesswork.
Mm. And I'll pose this to all three of you. We'll start with you, Anne. Clearly, Russia's invasion of Georgia wasn't met with a strong response. Russia's invasion of Ukraine in 2014 was not met with a strong response from the West. Do you think Putin learned some lessons here and thought he could do this and not get any pushback from the West? I mean, just yet again another encroachment?
Yes, I do think that he drew a series of conclusions. I mean, from 2014, also from the invasion of Syria, the invasion of Georgia, the multiple assassinations that took place in Western capitals, the use of poison. And so, I mean, on and on and on. There were numerous actions that were meant to test Western resolve. It's also true that the Russians, I think their view of America and their view of Europe is something they gained through, they read the far right press and they read far right media. They read the denunciations of the West as degenerate and so on. I think they believe that. And so they have a very twisted and narrow understanding of who Western politicians are and what they can and can't do. So I think it was a combination of their experience of getting away with things and their failure to understand Western politics.
Mhm. And Konstantin, now that that failure has been exposed and the West has pushed back, is there the ability for the Kremlin to learn here, do you think, for Vladimir Putin and his inner circle, that maybe they can't get away with this kind of behavior in the future, or is it too early to tell?
I think one of the major reasons why the war happened and these horrible things happened in Ukraine and to Russians as well, this is a result that Putin and his entourage, they were able to build a kind of an informational bubble. They are very mal-informed, and in a deep sense that they do not have experts who would be able to read analytics and to translate it to policymakers. Those who were able, they were driven out of administration or learned to stay silent. There might be some people who understand and who have good intelligence, but they stay out of it. We know that Putin is continuously fed with all kind of things that just reinforce his views, what, as Anna said, this twisted view of the Western politicians. So I'm not sure that any information that is not real, in the sense like your army in Kupiansk is destroyed. This is what he gets. But a larger meaning, analytics, no, they do not get it. They do not consult experts. They were not consulting. They fired the last experts during the war. And I think it's very difficult to get information across to them, including the information that is critical to their own decision making.
Mm-hmm. And Olga, Ukraine has been preparing for this war since 2014, right? I mean, there's been a war since 2014, and the Ukrainian government has been telling people that this is Russia, this is Putin, they're not done. Is there a sense, do you think, in Ukraine that the West has finally listened and understands? I mean, clearly countries like Poland and the Baltic states have been right on board since the beginning, saying, Putin's a threat. Is this, do you think, has been a tipping point for the West's view of Putin?
Well, I think it's definitely that there is better understanding of the situation in Ukraine itself and what Ukraine is and how it has been transformed in the past 8 years since 2014 than it was before this full-scale invasion, because all the analysis and predictions that the Western politicians and analysts were making before February 24th was about quick defeat of Ukraine, and no one expected, or almost no one in the West expected, such a strong resistance on behalf of Ukraine. So I think there is, in terms of also understanding Ukraine, there has been a shift, more acknowledgement of Ukrainians' agency, more acknowledgement of, in fact, the strengths of Ukrainian institutions, which were perceived as, very fragile, very weak, but it turned out not to be the case, and we are seeing Ukraine is resistant for more than 7 months already, and the government institutions and the public services are operating almost smoothly. The railways, the pensions are being paid, and the whole state apparatus is functioning. So I think not only the view and the understanding of Russia has changed in the West, but also the understanding of Ukraine and how this country has been, transformed, how strong it has become, and also, of course, the resilience and determination of Ukrainian people, and this newly formed Ukrainian identity, which is very clearly now so distinct from a Russian identity, from Belarusian identity, the societies that are so different now, those countries that were used to put in the same bunch so often, now it's becoming increasingly clear that it is wrong to somehow, equate them or put them on in an equal, in the same bunch. So I think, there is this change of perception of Ukraine, first of all, and of course of Russia too. But I think maybe the change of perception of Russia is not happening as fast as Ukrainians would hope. And this, again, we are returning to the point that has been made today already by Konstantin and by Anne, that Russia understands the language of power, and there is still so much timidity and, this belief that if we avoid escalation, then Putin will avoid escalation. If we tone down, then he will tone down. But this is not what is happening. And exactly the opposite is happening. The more the West indicates that they are willing to negotiate, that they are willing to, offer some de-escalation attempts, the more Putin escalates. And I think this is something that still has not maybe this realization of the nature of this regime and how it should be dealt with. This is something that maybe in Ukraine there is more understanding of the nature of this regime than in the West. But hopefully that will be that is changing slowly too.
Okay, and that's a great place to leave it. This has been a great conversation. I wish we could keep going, but we have to move on to the next panel. And Konstantin and Olga, thank you so much for joining us today. It's been really fascinating. Have a great day.
Thank you.